Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be here at the very start of what all of us hope is going to be an annual event. And there is no place in the world that is more appropriate to have a book festival than Berkeley. So great to be here, and thank you all for coming. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. At my left is Åsne Seierstad, who is from Norway, a very experienced foreign correspondent, war correspondent, who has reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Balkans. And her most recent, she said, what, 4 or 5 books in English, right?
5.
5 books translated into English. And the most recent is called One of Us, the story of Anders Breivik and the massacre in Norway. At my right is McClelland, whose work I'm sure many of you have seen in magazines, Mother Jones and elsewhere. Terrific reporting. Her most recent book is Irritable Hearts, a PTSD love story. And to Mac's right is Lars Svendsen, who, like Åsne, has come to us from Norway. He's a philosopher, teaches in the Department of Philosophy at University of Bergen, the author of many books, of which the most relevant for our discussion today is called A Philosophy of Evil. So what I would like to do is to ask each of the 3 panelists to very briefly, in 5 minutes or less, sort of tell us what they were writing about in these books under discussion, and in particular, if you learned something in the process that surprised you or was unexpected and in some way shed some light on our overall subject today, which is where violence comes from. Åsne, would you like to begin?
Thank you. Great to be here. I had an early morning walk. I've never been to Berkeley. It's an interesting, peculiar place. Looking forward to see more of it. Roots of violence, yes. All my life, all my books are about consequences of violence often. What happens to people in a war? What happens with the victims, but also with the perpetrators? And of course, where does it come from? Very often, wars are started by politicians and commanders and people high up. But the book that I wrote, my last book, is about a man who committed a terrible crime, a terrible act of terror in Norway, killing 77 of his fellow Norwegians. And where did that violence come from? He wasn't part of any organization. He was slightly part of a movement, but he was on his own, and he acted on his own. So just 2 minutes about the book. In Norway, on the 22nd of July, around 3:30 in the afternoon, there was a big explosion at the Prime Minister's office, like downstairs. This is a 17-story high building. After a very short time, a minute or so, it was clear that it was a terror act because there were pictures of the surveillance pictures of a car exploding. Then, 2 hours after that, the perpetrator of the bomb arrived on an island where young activists from the Labour Party had their summer camp. So he dressed as a policeman. He went to the island to say that he was going to inform the youngsters. So could they all gather at the middle of the island? When he went there, he started shooting them. And he was able to go around on that island for 1.5 hours until the police came, and he shot almost on an average 1 person a minute. Often in groups, the youngsters were lying down on the ground, pretending to be dead, and he shot them. They were hiding in the different houses behind pianos. So he spared no one. And when he was arrested, finally, he was asked why he had done it. And he said it was a book launch. Because he'd written a book that no one was interested in, a book about how Europe should get rid of all Muslims, how all mosques should be eradicated, all signs of Islamic culture should be demolished, and only pure European people should be have the rights to be full citizens. He also wanted to restore the patriarchy and other things that we can come to. Just checking the time, yeah. Why he called it a book launch is that that book he'd written, he went a long journey in his life that is of course more psychological, personal reasons, but when he talked about the politics of it, the last couple of years before he committed the terror, he was spending his time on the dark sides of the internet, the far-right extremist site, the anti-jihadi site, also following Americans like Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, others of these anti-Islamic ideologues, but they were not interested in him and in his writing and in his cutting and pasting actually of the internet that book consists of. So he'd been calculating how many people do I need to kill to be famous, to be read. He'd come to 12, but that was like the number. If I kill 12, the whole world will hear about me. He ended up killing 77. That is the story, short, about Anders Breivik for an introduction.
Okay, Mac, you're next.
So my book is about trauma, and it focuses on how trauma impacts your relationship both with yourself and with other people after you've been through trauma, which is often a result of violence, not always, of course, but the book specifically focuses on sexual violence a lot, because violence against women is actually the largest cause of post-traumatic stress disorder in America, not combat violence. The veterans and PTSD is also very important. So I focus a lot on civilian trauma and just sort of how it impacts a person who's been through trauma and also the people around them. And I think for me, one of the most profound things, both on a personal and kind of professional level, that I learned in writing the book was that my grandmother was a battered spouse. And we hear, there's a cycle of violence. Don't hit your kids, or if your kids, don't expose your kids to violence because they will grow up to perpetrate violence. But we don't hear as much about these sneakier and more insidious ways. Like, if you don't grow up to be a violent person, there are still lots of ways that the impact of being exposed to violence can sort of more quietly destroy relationships that you have with other people, and personally can lead to all sorts of mental and emotional disorders. So, and it's treatable, it's sort of like, don't hit your kids, don't get your kids exposed to violence or they'll be ruined, because that's sort of where the story ends. But I did a lot about how you can treat people who have been exposed to all kinds of violence, and there's a space for healing after violence that I think a lot of times we don't give enough thought to, because sure as cancer, if you were exposed to violence, you should be in treatment, and that treatment is available.
Lars?
Thank you. My book is an attempt to try to develop a whole secular concept of evil, trying to make a concept of evil that can be discussed, whatever religious convictions you might have. And what I do in my book is I try to stay away from defining evil too early. Of course, philosophers love definitions, but they're usually led astray by them. So what I do instead is, rather than asking what is evil, is why do people commit evil acts? And when we think of evil agents, we tend to think of someone who's monstrous, doing evil for the sake of evil. That's what I call demonic evil, and I think it's pure fiction. It belongs in the realm of fiction. When you look at why people commit evil acts, they do so for a number of reasons. So I discuss what I call instrumental evil. Someone doing evil, knowing that it's evil, in order to achieve something, some personal good or otherwise. And then you have perhaps the most interesting category, idealistic evil. Agents who commit evil acts believing that they're working for the force of good. And that's where the really monstrous acts tend to come from. It's, for instance, if we look back to, say, the Nazis, there's no doubt that a large number of Nazis believed that they were working for a better world. The SS regarded themselves as a moral elite. Terrorists are usually idealists. Now, someone might say that it's odd to refer to this as idealism because we tend often to see idealism as something good, and these ideals are certainly perverted. Yeah, they're perverted. But the fact that an ideal is perverted does not make the person who has the ideal into anything less of an idealist. And Anders Behring Breivik, for instance, writes in his manifesto that he feels that he has never done anything as meaningful as what he's doing, preparing for this terrorist act. He's completely convinced that he's really working for a better world. And the last category I operate with is stupid evil, committing evil acts without reflecting on whether what you're doing is evil or not. And when you think about how to eliminate evil, I think that, first of all, we have to understand that evil can never be eliminated completely, as long as we are moral agents. Because one of the main reasons for evil in this world is the fact that we are moral agents, that we differentiate between good and evil, and we tend to look for evil even when we're not directly threatened, and we try to eliminate it. And in doing so, we often bring even greater evils into the world. And so what should we do about it? I guess I'm a really old-fashioned guy, believing in old-fashioned enlightenment, humanism, and so on. So that's probably our best bet to reduce evil, but thinking that it can ever be completely eliminated is, I think that's entirely wrong-headed. So that's my brief overview of, I did it as short as I could in the book, but I was even shorter now.
You know, it strikes me that there's one thing in common from what all three of you are concerned with, which is this. I think usually we think of evil or violence as being something out there, hopefully fairly distant from us. We talk about, violent areas of the world, like the Middle East or parts of East Africa or whatever. But it seems to me that what all three of you have been talking about and have talked about at greater length in your books is that it's not necessarily just out there. One thing that struck me in your book, Lars, was where you wrote at one point, the worst evils are committed not by monsters, but by people no different from ourselves. And you elaborated on that quite a bit in talking about aspects of the Holocaust, something I hadn't known, which is the number of people who led the Nazi killing squads in Eastern Europe who had doctoral degrees. And I think you made a good point that people who are doing these things do think of themselves as moral agents. Mac, you went to conflict zones like Eastern Congo, Haiti, Burma, but you spoke about violence that you had discovered within your own family history. And your book, Åsne, is entitled One of Us, and about a horrible act of violence that took place in a society that I think most of us think of as one of the most peaceful and orderly in the world. So, any thoughts about all this? Are we wrong to look at the world in terms of conflict zones when the real conflict zone is inside us somewhere or in our societies somewhere? What do you think about all this?
Yeah, I think there is this quote by Solzhenitsyn, which I also have in my book, that where he says that the dividing line between good and evil does not go between political parties, between states, between groups and so on, but in every single human heart. And there is this tendency when we think about evil to think also in terms of them. Evil people are always somebody else, someone who differs essentially from ourselves. And that's also why I use a lot of space in my book to do away with this notion of demonic evil, that evil agents typically do evil because it's evil, because, hey, we're not like that. And if that's what evil is all about, we're all off the hook. That essentially closes off the insight in what capacity we ourselves have for committing evil acts. And when you look at perpetrators of the most monstrous acts, when you look at people who are involved in genocide and so on, you see that they are regular people. There's nothing about their histories before they go into such acts that really sets them apart from other people. Of course, that does not diminish their responsibility, cannot reduce them to a victim of circumstances and so on, but they're perfectly normal people. So what we have to try to figure out is how come normal people can do such unspeakable acts, really. And a large part of that has to do with justifying what you're doing, because humans are constructed that way, that we have to justify our actions, most of all to ourselves. And for instance, Anders Behring Breivik, I mean, there's really no surprise that he would not apologize or express regret for what he had done, because he had already justified his acts by his 1,500-page of nonsense, really. And we see also that the people who do things on purpose express far less regret than people who harm others by accident.
But when it comes to people committing violence, there are certain factors that go how to say there, that ingredients in them as a group that you can look at. And because if we don't speak at evil, but violence, like those who commit violence, if you look at research being done on violent criminals, murderers, and so on, almost 100% of them have had a bad childhood, terrible childhood, childhood of abuse, childhood of alcoholism, or just childhood of rejections and being left on their own. Of course, it doesn't mean that if you have a bad childhood, you will become a violent criminal, but if you are a violent criminal, very likely you've had a very bad childhood. Early childhood is very important. And I looked into this also in the case of Anders Breivik. And there's, so his history is parents' divorce. That didn't make him a terrorist, but his mother is very unstable psychologically. She's out and about, out at night, sometimes, doesn't come home at night. Neighbors are asking her, so why don't you have a babysitter for your children? And she says, they sleep when I leave and they sleep when I get back. The neighbors also think she's a prostitute because there's so many men coming and going, calling at her door, day and night. She has a breakdown when he is 4. So then this family come under observation, which is of course good for me as a journalist because there's so many documents about his childhood from 1980s. And he comes in as a child who doesn't smile, doesn't cry, doesn't react to people, that has no interest in toys or to play. And after a month at the psychiatric ward, the whole family, the clear recommendation is that he should be taken away from his mother to have a secure and a secure family situation. If he doesn't have that, they fear for consequences of misdevelopment. And then one little background of psychology here. There's a theory called the theory of attachment, which is about when you're born, every baby, even from the first week, first month, first year, they need to attach to someone. They can't just be taken care of by anyone coming and going. They need a mother, a father, a maid, whoever, but a person that is a secure attachment. If that doesn't happen, it will go straight into the building of the self, building of your personality, building of empathy. If you don't have a secure attachment to anyone, you might never be able to build empathy, which of course from Breivik, if it's one thing he doesn't have, it's empathy. So and this is just to give you an example of the background that is typical actually for violent criminals, is the same background that he had. So for him, growing up with a mother, the mother who would scream at him, "I wish you were dead, I wish you were never born, I want to get rid of you, I want to give you away to society for me to live my own life." This is documented things that she said when the doctors listened to her. And then the next moment she would cling to him and hug him, and so it was like the person who was going to give him the security was also the one that he feared the most. So that is, I think that childhood is important. And just one little thing about the French Kouachi brothers in Paris. Chilling read about their childhood. It's a mirror image of Breivik's. The French authorities saw these kids running around at night. Nobody took care of them. They wanted to take them away from the single mother, who was also a prostitute. They ended up she had 5 children. They ended up taking 3, and they left her with those two brothers, until she committed suicide when they were 10 and 12. Then they got into foster care, but it was too late. Why do they commit violence? Why are they able to kill in the face, as those 3 have done?
Yeah, I feel that I covered the Kouachi brothers a little bit as well, and I think that what you're talking about brings up an important point, which is there are different kinds of violence. And when we start having a conversation about the Holocaust and genocide and murder, you sound like a little bit of a hippie to be like, there's emotional violence. But I mean, it's really, the importance of it can't be understated. I mean, the people you're talking about were not victims of physical violence, but of emotional violence their whole lives. And to get back to your question, Adam, I feel like part of the reason there's a line for some reason, physical violence, we're like, that's monsters. And then emotional violence, everyone is guilty of probably perpetrating a little bit of emotional violence at some point in their lives, or they could see how they could. And I think it's a little bit too close to home, and it makes people very uncomfortable. And it's easier to other physical violence as a thing that is completely apart from emotional violence when it's not, and when the consequence of it aren't that different either.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction here between individual violence and group violence. And I think that the sort of factors Åsne talks about, they're far more important in terms of individual violence committed by sort of solo terrorists and so on. When it comes to group violence, let's say police battalion 101, one of the early groups went into Eastern Europe, 87,000 face-to-face killings of Jews.
This is one of the Nazi death squads, the Einsatzgruppen.
Yeah. What you see is that they were recruited from average German men in the Hamburg area. Nothing separates them from the rest of the population. And what's even most chilling about that is that this was very early in the extermination of the Jews, and they were actually told before they started that, okay, now we have to do something that will take its toll on you. And those who feel that they're not up for it, well, you don't have to. Only 8 to 10% chose not to participate, and the rest did, even though They didn't have to. They could have said no. They were allowed to say no. And just one comment also about empathy, which is also often brought out. Sure, empathy is important, and we tend to think of empathy as so immediate, but empathy can also be sort of disabled by cognitive processes, by our thinking about who is worthy of our empathy, because empathy is a really intimate relation, and you might think that this other person is not someone I really can be in an intimate relation with. For an SS officer, it would be simply unworthy to stand in such an intimate relation to a Jew. For one of Arkan's tigers in the former Yugoslavia, having such a relation to a Bosnian Muslim would be unworthy. So even though we tend to think of empathy as immediate, it can be set aside by our thinking about with whom to empathize. And you can have empathy towards one group and not towards another. And say, Hitler, I'm sure he had great empathy for Blondie, his German shepherd, but very little for a large group of humans.
Well, of course, in any war, the military cultivates your having tremendous sense of empathy and comradeship for your fellow soldiers, and none at all for the enemy. And I'm sure when German Police Battalion 101 came home in 1943 or whatever, people told them, thank you for your service, because they had done what they were ordered to do. Mac, I have a question for you. In your book, you described how you had at one point done a magazine piece after you were in Haiti where you talked about your own experience of PTSD there. And then you found that many people responded to that piece by saying they had had similar experiences, not necessarily with being in Haiti, but with having PTSD-like symptoms after experiencing domestic violence and things like that.
Sure. I mean, that when I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, I thought that it was completely absurd because that's a thing for people who've been to war and had to kill people or saw other people be killed, or at any rate were doing much worse things and more upsetting things than me. And we have sort of a culture we have sort of like a hierarchy of violence, and if you have not experienced a violence of a certain level, you sort of don't deserve to be impacted by it, I think. And I have heard that from a lot of people who said, I went through like a horrible childhood, or I was raped in college, but it's not as bad as if I had been gang raped in another country, or if I had, seen my parents murdered or something. There's always this like idea that you don't deserve to be impacted by violence, and that we should just sort of shed violence, buck up and get over it. So I've heard, and I got an email a couple days ago, it's funny that you asked me, from this woman who said that she had almost been assaulted by several men when she was walking home. Some stranger intervened, and so nothing happened, but she still had suffered like extreme symptomology. She had really bad post-traumatic stress disorder for years and years and years, and one of her biggest problems with coping with it was that she didn't feel like she deserved to have that. And not only did she not feel like she deserved it, all the people around her didn't feel like she deserved to be upset by that, because she had escaped this violence that people were trying to perpetrate on her. So she was only threatened, but the threat of violence is often as devastating emotionally and psychologically as completed violence. Unfortunately, we don't have empathy for that particular situation. So I do hear that from people all the time, and you'll hear people who talk about their after effects sort of degrading their own experience. People will always say, what I saw wasn't as bad as what you saw, or what I've been through wasn't as bad as what the people in Norway have been through, or there are people who've had much worse experiences than me. Like, we don't feel empowered to just say, this happened and it was awful, because there's always something worse that happened.
Lars, a moment ago you were making the distinction between individual and societal evil or violence. I would like to ask you and Åsne, as our guests from overseas here, what do you think as you look at American society in terms of violence? Here we are, a country which, you know, is in love with guns. Our national sport, American football, leaves a pretty high percentage of its veteran players with brain damage. Our police forces seem to have a tendency to quite readily shoot young black men all the time. Here you are, both coming from a much more peaceful country. What do you think about violence when you look at the United States?
You want to run with it?
One thing about guns, there are more guns per person in Norway than in the US. So it's also about a culture, I think. These are mainly hunting guns, and they're well stored. It's not pistols, it's not for play, it's not for fun. It's like, you know, you go and hunt your elk every autumn. So it's about respect for guns too. What do we think? Well, I think it seems that it's a cultural things. I don't say in America, but it's obviously a problem in the American police force of culture, of getting away with it, of seeing, of saving yourself is more important because you might be attacked than to wait and see what happens. Like it's like, for instance, Anders Breivik, when he was finally caught, he probably would have been killed in America. He was going along. They told him arms up, and he was like, okay, arms up, knees down. He didn't kneel because why would he kneel? You know, he didn't do what he was told. And then he even had those. He had a flak jacket and everything, and he had even those threads going out of his vest, his jacket. So they were thinking he has a bomb. So they were about to shoot him, but they waited, and I realized it was an iPod. It wasn't. It was an iPod to listen to music. Oh, yeah, iPods. Yeah. So, which is important because he is one of very few terrorists that we can get his story. We can question him. He was 10 weeks in court. Most terrorists are either getting killed or they kill themselves. So that gives, because of he committed this violent crime in a country, as you said, of very of big peace, and also treating. How do you treat criminals and violent criminals? Like I remember during the trial, the international community, the media, including America, they were so shocked that he was. Handshaking with the judges, the prosecutors. He was, in Russia he would have been put in a cage. He would not have been able to, you know, dress as he liked and things like that. So I think that, I think there's this cultural thing of respect, which is important. And yeah, but I'm not an expert on America. But of course, there's racism too, right? That some people are lesser importance, so they're easier to shoot, or you know. So it's that's how it seems from outside, at least. That
might just also mention one other fact about Norway is that, of course, we have the highest level on earth of generalized trusts. 9 out of 10 Norwegians believe that other people are generally to be trusted. And and the Danes have equally high numbers. And of course, that does a lot for how human interaction plays out in a society. And if you look at factors which enhance such trust, it's really strong rule of law, strong civil society, very low levels of corruption, and so on. And also, we're pretty similar. You tend to trust people who look and behave more like yourself, and Norwegians, we're pretty much alike, even though there is immigration and so on. That also enhances. And if you have a very diverse society, you do have a tougher job creating trust. And what we've seen, for instance, with recent incidents with the police and so on here in the US, is that the trust levels, they probably couldn't be lower within the police force as to the public they're engaging with.
We've got only 10 minutes left, and I would like to give the rest of you here a chance to ask questions of our three visitors here. And I'm going to call on you, speak up loudly. I'll repeat the question into the microphone, I think. So, I see a hand up, a woman in the, yeah. What? So the question sort of is about, does the birth of a sense of superiority of one group over another inevitably lead to some sort of violence?
Well, should I take? Yeah. Really doesn't take much. I mean, differentiating between them and us is crucial for forming personal identity and social identity. The thing is that we often tend to let that distinction have ethical consequences in one group having higher moral worth, that is one's own group, and the other group having less. And it really doesn't take essential differences to create that distinction. And when you do that, you're already well on the way. And to use a biblical image, when you divide the world into sheep and goats, then the sheep, the self-proclaimed the self-proclaimed good, have a tendency to do the most horrendous things to the goats.
Okay, all right, okay. Any comments on those points from any of the three of you, or should we move on?
Well, just like Norway has a capitalist economy, it's one of the countries on earth with the largest amounts of economic freedom. So I think that we have to be a little bit more differentiated here in coming to terms with it. But of course, what I wholeheartedly agree with is that when such violations are committed, we all as citizens have an obligation to protest, Because if you live in a liberal democracy and you do not protest, you're essentially saying this is fine. So we all have that moral obligation. And by joining in, protesting, you can redefine the moral field in terms of what is acceptable and what is not, and so on.
4 minutes left.
Here, here. Yeah.
I really appreciate your lecture. I was thinking of Beyond Good and Evil with Nietzsche. I was wondering if that with Lars, if you put that informed sort of some of your thinking. And then also, I noticed that, when we talk about the Vietnam War, things that have happened in Istanbul, genocide, mass genocide, it's always safe in the past, and we get really impassioned when slavery happened. God, that's awful. And it's always in the past. It seems like there's a rule like it has to be 40, 50 years ago, or people don't want to talk about the Palestinians, Israelis. And I'm not sure if that's just me or if I'm isolated in that thinking.
Okay, I think question is, do we pay too much attention to violence and evil, outbreaks of evil in the past, and not enough in the present? Does anyone want to say anything about that?
I would say no, because I think that you can't really talk too much about violence from the past. There's more lessons to be learned that we haven't even begun to yet. We're still talking about the way people from the Vietnam War were affected, and there are several generations after that generation that served that are still being affected. And if anything, I think we're not talking about how they've been affected enough.
Okay, how about one more question, because we are running out of time over here.
Yeah, it was mentioned that Anders Breivik saw this as a sort of book launch action, and we know that ISIS is using horrible violence as sort of a media campaign, and these mass murderers in the United States, also their desire was for notoriety. So what is the role of the media in this? Are they in some way complicit sometimes in the violence? Do they have a role that they should examine?
I think that in the case of Breivik, I'll be quick, I know time is running out. He is using the media. Yeah, he called it a book launch. That was the first stage of his conservative revolution, as he called it. The next stage was the trial. That would give him a stage. And then the third stage would be all the rest of us who would be inspired by his acts and then do the conservative revolution in Europe, which did not happen. He does really not have the ability to inspire. But for me to write about him, I think that the force of journalism is to show the facts. Like if you don't show and disclose all facts, there's a big dark room of rumors that can be made, speculation, conspiracies. So it's like the minute by minute or second by second or like event to event. That's our job to disclose. I think that's important. Now he can rot in prison if he likes. He's going to be there for the rest of his life. But I think that what he did, it's important to have a look at it. And when it comes to ISIS, I think you're right, because we are using their pictures. The pictures where they are always winning. They're on their trucks. They're with their sunglasses, bandanas. They are the cool guys. Because there are no journalists in Syria now to give us those pictures of when did you see a killed ISIS fighter? No, we always see them killing the others, and that is inspiring many young people in Europe, less in America, but that is very dangerous to let them use their way of presenting themselves.
Speaking of book launches in a non-violent way, all of us here will be down in the book signing tent, which is on Alston Way to your left as you go out of the building as soon as we're done here. I'm unfortunately under instructions to end this program at 10 minutes of, so that you have time to get to the next event. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to our speakers, and thanks also to the sponsors of this program, Norla and the Norway House Foundation.